The war room fell silent as another red dot disappeared from the holographic galaxy map. Fleet Admiral Rook watched the light fade, knowing it represented 3 billion souls on the mining world of Tertius Prime. The hegemony had claimed another system, bringing their total conquest to 71% of known space. Around the crystalline table, representatives from 43 species sat in grim contemplation. Each delegate came from worlds that would make most civilized beings die within hours. The quartz homeworld bathed its inhabitants in radiation that could melt steel. The reef people evolved in crushing ocean depths where the pressure could flatten starships. The hive crawled through methane storms that burned like acid rain. Yet even these hardy survivors were losing ground to the hegemony's relentless expansion. The enemy fought with a brutality that shocked seasoned warriors from Deathworlds. They showed no mercy, took no prisoners, and left nothing but scorched planets in their wake. Rook's translucent form flickered with frustrated energy patterns as he addressed the assembly. His species communicated through light pulses beneath their crystal skin, but the translation devices rendered his words into dozens of languages simultaneously. The defense grid at Sector 7 collapsed 3 cycles ago. Our projections show the hegemony breaking through the outer rim defenses within 5 standard cycles. After that, they will have clear access to our core worlds. A rumble of concern rippled through the chamber. Delegate Moss from the volcanic ember worlds raised, a rocky appendage. Our thermal warriors can hold the magma belt for perhaps 2 more cycles. Beyond that, even our people cannot survive the hegemony's plasma bombardments. The deep current colonies report similar losses, added Scout Leader Finn of the Reef delegation. His gills fluttered nervously as he spoke. Their new battle cruisers can operate underwater. Our advantage in aquatic combat is gone. The grim reports continued for hours. Every species present had lost worlds, fleets, and entire generations to the hegemony's advance. The Deathworld Alliance had formed out of desperate necessity, uniting species that had never before cooperated. Their combined fleets represented the toughest, most resilient beings in the galaxy. It was not enough. Commander Vale's voice buzzed through the cluster mind communication array, representing the collective thoughts of 10,000 hive individuals. Analysis indicates current defensive capabilities insufficient. Probability of survival beyond 10 cycles, 7%. Recommendation, seek additional allies. Rook's light patterns shifted to skeptical blue. Every major civilization has either joined the hegemony willingly or been conquered. The neutral worlds refuse involvement. Who else is there? Finn cleared his throat, producing a sound like water bubbling through stone. Perhaps not every civilization. Our deep space scouts have made contact with previously unknown species along the galactic rim. Most were too primitive to consider as allies, but he activated a holographic display showing a small blue-green planet orbiting a yellow star. The world looked deceptively peaceful from space, but the data scrolling beside it painted a different picture. This planet registers as a Class 12 Deathworld, the highest classification our sensors have ever recorded. The chamber erupted in shocked silence. Class 12 exceeded even their own hostile homeworlds. Most Alliance species came from Class 8 or Class 9 environments. Class 12 suggested conditions so extreme that life should be impossible. The dominant species calls themselves humans, Finn continued. Bipedal mammals, average lifespan 80 cycles, population approaching 8 billion. Their world features active tectonics that reshape continents, weather patterns that can destroy cities, predators that hunt in coordinated packs, disease, vectors that adapt faster than medicine can counter them, and radiation exposure from their star that damages genetic material. Dr. Kit from the Tundra worlds leaned forward with scientific curiosity. How do they survive such conditions? They do not merely survive, they thrive. Our scouts observed them living in every climate zone on their planet. Deserts hot enough to cook flesh, frozen wastelands colder than space, underwater cities deeper than our deepest colonies and mountain settlements where the air is too thin to breathe. They have somehow adapted to environments that span the tolerance ranges of 17 different Alliance species. The data streaming across the hologram grew more incredible with each revelation. Humans regularly survived injuries that would kill most Alliance species. They healed from wounds that should be fatal. They operated effectively after losing amounts of blood that would send other beings into terminal shock. Their psychological profiles are equally remarkable, Finn added. They form social bonds across genetic lines, adopting members from competing groups. They display self-sacrifice behaviors for individuals they have never met. Most remarkably, they have eliminated warfare among their own species through something they call the United Nations. Vale's buzz grew more rapid as the hive processed this information. Clarification requested. Species achieved planetary unity while maintaining individual consciousness? Confirmed. They retain separate nations and cultures, but cooperate on existential threats. When our scouts revealed themselves, every human government voted to establish diplomatic contact within one solar cycle. The implications slowly sank in around the chamber. A species that could survive Class 12 conditions might actually be able to fight the hegemony on equal terms. More importantly, a species that had learned to unite despite their differences might understand the Alliance's desperate situation. Rook's crystal form pulsed with cautious hope. What is their technological level? Primitive by our standards. They have achieved interplanetary travel but lack faster-than-light capability. However, their technology shows remarkable ingenuity. They build tools for environments their bodies cannot survive, then use those tools to survive anyway. Delegate Moss rumbled thoughtfully. A species from a Class 12 world would understand the concept of alliance for survival. They might be sympathetic to our situation. The question is whether they would be effective allies, Commander Vale observed. Physical hardiness means nothing without military capability. Finn displayed another set of data. Our scouts observed their historical records. These humans have been in continuous warfare for their entire recorded history. They have developed strategic thinking, tactical innovation, and weapons technology that exceeds their general scientific level. They appear to excel at conflict. The debate that followed lasted through 3 full cycles. Some delegates argued that a primitive species would be useless against the hegemony's advanced fleets. Others contended that desperation justified any attempt at reinforcement. The final vote was close. 23 species in favor, 20 against. The deciding factor came from an unexpected source. The youngest member of the Alliance, the Skyriders from the storm-racked aerial cities of Nimbus, cast the final ballot. If they survive on a Class 12 world, they understand death, she said, simply. If they understand death, they understand why we fight. 3 cycles later, a formal invitation was transmitted toward the small blue planet on the galactic rim. The message was simple. We are the Deathworld Alliance. We face extinction. We invite you to stand with us. The Alliance expected a cautious response. Perhaps a small delegation of diplomats. Maybe a few thousand volunteers, if the humans proved interested in galactic politics. They had no way of knowing that they had just issued a challenge to a species that had never met a fight they would not take. A species that considered impossible odds to be a starting point rather than a deterrent. A species that had spent their entire evolutionary history turning death worlds into homes. The invitation had been sent. Now they would discover what 8 billion humans thought about bullies who conquered peaceful worlds. The proximity alarms at Crossroads Station began screaming at 0347 hours Galactic Standard Time. Traffic Control Officer Reed nearly dropped her thermal beverage as the sensor readings flooded her display. What appeared to be a small fleet was approaching the neutral station at the edge of Alliance space, a small fleet that registered as 847 individual vessels. "Get me Admiral Rook immediately," she barked into her communicator. "And wake up, everyone. In the diplomatic wing. We have a situation." Within minutes, the Alliance leadership had assembled in the emergency council chamber. The holographic display showed the approaching human fleet in devastating detail. Massive ships that dwarfed anything in the Alliance Navy moved in perfect formation, accompanied by smaller vessels that still outclassed most Alliance cruisers. "This was supposed to be a diplomatic contact," Dr. Kit muttered, her fur standing on end with anxiety. "They are responding to an invitation with an invasion force." Scout Leader Finn studied the tactical readouts with professional interest. "These are not warships configured for conquest. The power signatures suggest they are carrying enormous numbers of life forms. This appears to be a colonization fleet." The implications hit the room like a shockwave. The humans had not sent a diplomatic mission or even a military expedition. They had packed up a significant portion of their civilization and traveled across the galaxy to respond to the Alliance's call for help. "How many life forms?" Rook asked, his crystal form flickering with nervous energy patterns. "Sensors indicate approximately 2.3 million individuals across all vessels," Finn reported, "plus equipment, supplies, and what appears to be agricultural materials sufficient to establish permanent settlements." Commander Vale's cluster mind buzzed with rapid calculations. "This response exceeds all projected parameters. Expected human response. Diplomatic mission of 50 to 100 individuals. Actual response. Population migration of 2.3 million individuals. The first human ship docked at Crossroads Station 3 hours later. The airlock cycled and Admiral Ross stepped through, followed by a delegation of 12 humans representing various Earth governments. Unlike the Alliance species, who required environmental suits to survive outside their native atmospheres, the humans wore simple uniforms that seemed adequate for any conditions. Admiral Ross was a middle-aged human, with graying hair and calm eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him. He moved with the confidence of someone who had spent decades in space, but there was something else in his manner that the Alliance delegates found unsettling. He carried himself like a predator that had learned perfect self-control. "Thank you for the invitation," he said in heavily accented Galactic Common, which he had apparently learned during the journey from Earth. "We apologize for the size of our response fleet. When Earth's governments received your message, the discussion was brief. We do not abandon friends, and we do not tolerate bullies." Dr. Kit stepped forward to begin the standard first contact protocols. "Admiral Ross, we appreciate your enthusiasm, but we should begin with cultural exchange procedures to ensure mutual understanding of expectations and capabilities." Admiral Ross looked puzzled. "With respect, Doctor, we understand the situation perfectly. An aggressive empire is conquering peaceful worlds. You asked for help. We brought help." He gestured toward the viewports where the human fleet hung in space like a small constellation. 2.3 million volunteers from every nation on Earth. Military personnel, engineers, doctors, farmers, teachers, scientists. Everything needed to support a long-term commitment. The simple directness of his response left the Alliance delegation speechless. There were no negotiations about terms, no discussions of payment or territorial concessions, no complex treaties, defining mutual obligations. The humans had simply decided to help and acted on that decision with overwhelming force. "Admiral," Rook ventured carefully, "our intelligence suggested that your species lacks faster-than-light travel capability. How did you traverse galactic distances?" "We built FTL drives based on the technical specifications included in your invitation message," Admiral Ross replied matter-of-factly. "It took our scientists 4 months to understand the principles and 8 months to construct the necessary infrastructure. We launched the fleet 18 months after receiving your transmission." Dr. Kit's scientific mind reeled. "You developed faster-than-light technology in 4 months? Our species required centuries to achieve such breakthroughs." "We had motivation," Admiral Ross said simply, "and we work well under pressure." The next several days shattered every assumption the Alliance held about primitive species and first contact procedures. The humans did not request permission to establish bases or colonies. They asked where help was most needed and began setting up operations immediately. Their ships carried modular habitats that could be configured for any environment. Within 72 hours, human settlements were operating on asteroid mining platforms, underwater research stations, and the surface of airless moons. They adapted to each environment with casual efficiency that left Alliance observers stunned. Dr. Nova, the Alliance's chief xenobiologist, conducted the first comprehensive study of human physiology and psychology. Her reports would later be classified as too disturbing for general distribution among Alliance populations. Subject Ross 7 completed the standard physical evaluation in 12.7 minutes, she dictated to her research log. Previous record holder, a quartz warrior, required 31.4 minutes. When questioned about his performance, the subject indicated that the evaluation resembled basic military fitness tests from his homeworld. The psychological evaluations proved even more unsettling. Humans demonstrated cognitive flexibility that bordered on the supernatural. They learned alien languages in weeks, adapted to new social customs in days, and formed emotional bonds with Alliance species faster than most Alliance members bonded with their own kind. Subject, Ross 23, has achieved conversational fluency in hive cluster speak, quartz light language, and reef sonar communication, Dr. Nova reported after 1 week of observation. When asked to explain this rapid language acquisition, the subject indicated that humans commonly learn multiple languages and that alien communication methods were merely interesting variations on familiar themes. But the most disturbing discovery came during combat simulations. The Alliance had developed training programs to evaluate military effectiveness in various scenarios. These simulations were designed to push trained warriors to their absolute limits. The humans treated them as recreational activities. Captain Wire led a squad through a scenario designed to simulate the hegemony's most brutal tactics. The simulation featured toxic atmosphere, limited ammunition, multiple casualties, and overwhelming enemy forces. Previous record holder had managed to complete 17% of the scenario objectives before tactical withdrawal became necessary. Wire's team completed 97% of the objectives and requested permission to restart the simulation with more challenging parameters. The humans do not fight like soldiers, General Tor observed after reviewing combat footage. They fight like apex predators who learn to use tools and coordinate pack tactics. The final shock came during psychological evaluation interviews. Dr. Kit had developed questions designed to evaluate species compatibility and cultural integration potential. The interviews typically revealed significant barriers to cooperation between species with different evolutionary backgrounds. The humans answered every question with variations of the same theme. Other people were worth protecting. Cooperation was more effective than competition, and differences were opportunities to learn rather than reasons for conflict. Dr. Kit, Admiral Ross said during his evaluation interview, "We have been fighting wars on our homeworld for thousands of years. We have learned that the only way to end wars is to make the people worth more alive than dead, and to make their problems your problems. You invited us to make your problems our problems. We accept." 3 weeks after first contact, Alliance Command faced an unprecedented situation. The humans were not just willing to help fight the hegemony, they were eager to adopt Alliance culture, learn Alliance languages, and treat Alliance worlds as homes worth defending. The primitive species from the Galactic Rim had responded to the Alliance's desperate invitation by essentially volunteering to become galactic citizens overnight, and their enthusiasm was absolutely terrifying to beings who had spent centuries learning to survive through caution and careful calculation. The Alliance had requested help from strangers. They had received adoption by a species that seemed incapable of recognizing the concept of strangers. The tactical briefing for Operation Reclaim began like every Alliance military meeting for the past 3 centuries, methodical, cautious, and designed to minimize casualties through careful planning. Colonel Max listened politely for the first hour as Alliance commanders outlined their strategy for retaking Kepler-7, a mining colony captured by hegemony forces 6 months earlier. The plan called for a systematic siege lasting 8 to 12 months. Alliance forces would establish defensive positions at safe distances, cut off supply lines, and gradually wear down enemy resistance through resource attrition. Casualties were projected at 15 to 20%, which Alliance Command considered acceptable for such a strategic objective. When the briefing concluded, Colonel Max stood and activated his own holographic display. The human battle plan appeared beside the Alliance strategy, and the contrast was immediately apparent. "With respect to my Alliance colleagues," Max began in his cheerful tone that somehow made experienced warriors nervous, "your plan will work perfectly if the hegemony behaves exactly as you expect for the next year. However, I suspect they might try to adapt." General Tor's crystal form flickered with skeptical patterns. "Colonel, your species has been in space for less than 2 years. Perhaps experienced strategists should lead complex operations." Max smiled, an expression that Alliance species had learned to find deeply unsettling on human faces. "General, my species has been conducting warfare for over 10,000 years. We have some experience with complex operations." The human plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Rather than siege warfare, humans proposed direct assault using techniques that violated every civilized rule of engagement. They would land forces directly in contested zones, establish forward operating bases in supposedly uninhabitable areas, and launch coordinated attacks using psychological warfare tactics that most Alliance species considered war crimes. This strategy requires accepting casualty rates that approach 50%. Commander Vale buzzed through the cluster mind communication array. "Such losses are unacceptable." "Our projections indicate casualty rates closer to 8%, Max replied. "The difference is that we plan to inflict casualties rather than avoid them." The debate continued for 6 hours until Admiral Ross entered the briefing room and delivered the decision with characteristic human directness. "Colonel Max will lead the assault. Alliance forces will provide support as requested. Operation begins in 72 hours. Kepler-7 was a barren rock orbiting a dying star, valuable only for the rare metals buried in its core. The hegemony had fortified the colony with standard defensive positions, energy shields, automated weapon platforms, and underground bunkers, designed to withstand prolonged bombardment. The human assault began at 0300 hours, with tactics that Alliance observers initially mistook for mass suicide. Human dropships descended directly into the heaviest defensive fire, landing within meters of hegemony positions. Instead of seeking cover, human soldiers advanced immediately, using portable shields and coordinated movement patterns that seemed choreographed. Captain Wire led Alpha Squad through a hegemony stronghold, moving through corridors filled with toxic atmosphere that would kill most Alliance species in minutes. Her soldiers wore basic environmental suits, but moved with fluid precision, communicating through hand signals and micro-expressions that allowed perfect coordination without electronic communication. "Contact left. 3 hostiles," she whispered into her microphone, and 3 human soldiers moved to flanking positions before the hegemony forces realized they were under attack. The engagement lasted 17 seconds. 3 enemy soldiers eliminated, 0 human casualties. Alliance observers monitoring the battle from orbit watched in stunned silence as human forces moved through the colony like water flowing downhill, adapting to resistance, flowing around obstacles, and eliminating enemy positions with mechanical efficiency. "They are not fighting," Dr. Nova whispered from the command ship. "They are hunting." The psychological warfare proved even more devastating than the direct combat. Humans had analyzed hegemony communication intercepts and identified specific fears common to enemy species. They used sound generators to mimic the predator calls from hegemony homeworlds, deployed holographic projections of nightmare scenarios, and somehow convinced enemy forces that human soldiers could appear anywhere, at any time. Within 6 hours, hegemony forces began surrendering rather than face human assault teams. Within 12 hours, the colonial government requested alliance protection. Within 18 hours, Operation Reclaim was complete. Final casualties. Human forces lost 7 individuals to equipment failures, 0 to enemy action. Hegemony forces lost 127 to combat, 1,040 to voluntary surrender. Colony infrastructure damage, minimal. The Alliance had projected 8 to 12 months of careful siege warfare. The humans had achieved total victory in less than 1 day. The after-action briefing was conducted in the same chamber where Alliance commanders had outlined their cautious strategy 5 days earlier. The mood was very different. Explain the tactical decision to land directly in hostile fire, General Tor requested, his crystal form pulsing with confused patterns. Captain Wire answered with the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to children. Hegemony defensive positions were designed to repel cautious attackers approaching from safe distances. They were not prepared for immediate close-quarters engagement. We exploited their tactical assumptions. Your soldiers operated in toxic atmosphere without apparent difficulty, Dr. Kidd observed. Our biological assessments indicated that environment should be lethal to human physiology. Uncomfortable, not lethal, Wire corrected. We train in worse conditions on Earth. Toxic atmosphere is manageable with proper equipment and short exposure times. Commander Vale's cluster mind buzzed rapidly as 10,000 individual hive entities processed the battle data. Human forces demonstrated coordination patterns that suggest telepathic communication. How is this achieved without technological assistance? Wire looked genuinely puzzled by the question. We grow up together, train together, fight together. After a few years, you learn to predict what your teammates will do. It is not telepathy. It is teamwork. The simple explanation only made the achievement more unsettling. Humans had developed intuitive cooperation that surpassed what most species achieved through technological enhancement. But the most disturbing revelation came during the intelligence briefing. Human forces had not just defeated the hegemony garrison. They had convinced enemy survivors to provide detailed information about hegemony military capabilities, strategic plans, and psychological profiles of enemy leadership. How did you obtain this intelligence? Admiral Rook asked, reviewing reports that contained information Alliance spies had spent decades trying to acquire. Colonel Max shrugged, another human gesture that Alliance species found oddly threatening. We asked nicely. Hegemony soldiers are conscripts fighting for an empire that treats them as expendable resources. When offered alternative employment with people who treat them as valuable individuals, most were happy to cooperate. The intelligence reports revealed that the hegemony had built their military doctrine around fighting other species that shared their cultural values: honor, hierarchy, and predictable tactical responses. They were completely unprepared for enemies, who fought without honor, ignored hierarchy, and treated warfare as problem-solving rather than ritualized combat. The hegemony views warfare as political extension, the captured intelligence officer explained during his voluntary debriefing. Humans view warfare as existential competition. The difference is psychologically devastating to our forces. 3. Days after the battle, long-range sensors detected something unprecedented. Hegemony forces were withdrawing from forward positions throughout the sector. Not retreating under pressure, but voluntarily abandoning strategic assets rather than risk engagement with human forces. The Alliance leadership gathered for an emergency session to discuss implications that challenged their fundamental understanding of galactic warfare. A single human operation has altered hegemony strategic behavior across 17 star systems, Scout Leader Finn reported. They are treating human involvement as an existential threat requiring major tactical revision. Admiral Ross attended the meeting via holographic projection from the human fleet, where 2.3 million volunteers were receiving combat training that would prepare them for deployment across Alliance space. Admiral, Rook asked carefully, how many more operations like Kepler-7 can your forces conduct simultaneously? Ross considered the question with the same casual attitude humans applied to all military matters. Currently, maybe 200. Similar operations. Give us 6 months to establish proper supply chains and training facilities, and we can probably manage 1,000. The Alliance had spent 3 centuries building a defensive coalition capable of resisting hegemony expansion. The humans had arrived 18 months ago and were already discussing offensive operations on a scale that would reshape galactic politics. The primitive species from the galactic rim had not just joined the Alliance's war. They had transformed it into something completely different, a conflict that the hegemony might actually lose. The monthly statistical report landed on Admiral Rook's desk with the weight of a collapsing star. 6 months had passed since the Kepler-7 operation, and the numbers painted a picture that defied every model of galactic warfare ever developed. By Alliance strategists. Human population in Alliance space, 47.2 million and growing daily. New arrivals were not just military personnel, but entire families, research teams, agricultural specialists, engineers, artists, teachers, and what humans cheerfully called entrepreneurs. They had turned the Alliance's desperate military coalition into something resembling an interspecies civilization. Military victories. 847 successful operations across 23 sectors. Alliance losses. Statistically insignificant. Hegemony losses. Total withdrawal from 12 major systems, strategic retreat from 31 minor systems, and the complete abandonment of forward operating bases that had anchored their expansion for decades. But these numbers, impressive as they were, only hinted at the real scope of the human problem. Dr. Nova submitted her xenobiological assessment with the grim satisfaction of a scientist who had discovered something that challenged the fundamental laws of nature. The humans are not just adapting to our environments, she wrote in her classified report. They are improving our environments for us. The evidence was overwhelming. Human engineers had retrofitted Alliance ships with modifications that increased efficiency by 400% while reducing maintenance requirements by 60%. Human doctors had developed medical techniques that worked across species barriers, creating the first truly universal healthcare system in galactic history. Human farmers were terraforming hostile worlds in months, rather than the decades typically required by Alliance species. Most disturbing of all, humans were making these improvements while simultaneously conducting military operations that had reduced the hegemony's effective territory by almost 30%. Ambassador Ray presented his quarterly diplomatic report to the Alliance Council with the enthusiasm that humans brought to every activity. His cheerful demeanor had initially been reassuring to Alliance leadership. After 6 months of human involvement, that same cheerfulness had become profoundly unsettling. Excellent news from the diplomatic front, Ray announced, his smile visible even through the holographic projection. We have established formal relations with 127 previously neutral species, negotiated mutual defense pacts with 89 independent worlds, and received applications for Alliance membership from 34 former hegemony colonies. The numbers represented diplomatic achievements that should have required decades of careful negotiation. Humans had accomplished them as a side project while fighting a war. Ambassador Ray, Scout Leader Finn inquired carefully, how exactly did you convince former hegemony colonies to defect? Ray's expression suggested that the answer should be obvious. We offered them a better deal. The hegemony rules through fear and exploitation. We offer partnership, mutual benefit, and protection from bullies. Most people prefer partnership over exploitation when given a choice. The simple logic was unassailable and absolutely terrifying to species that had spent centuries learning to navigate complex diplomatic protocols. Humans approached interspecies relations with the same directness they applied to warfare. Identify the problem, implement the solution, move on to the next challenge. Commander Vale's cluster mind had been processing human integration data for weeks, and the collective analysis of 10,000 individual hive entities had reached disturbing conclusions. Human socialization patterns exceed all documented parameters, Vale reported to the Emergency Council session. Observed humans demonstrate stronger emotional bonds with Alliance species after 6 months of contact than most Alliance species develop with their own kind after decades of interaction. The psychological profiles were genuinely frightening. Humans did not just tolerate alien cultures, they embraced them with an enthusiasm that bordered on biological impossibility. They learned alien customs, adopted alien perspectives, and integrated alien philosophies into their worldview as if xenophilia were encoded in their genetic structure. Lieutenant Ben had become the subject of intensive study after achieving something that Alliance scientists had considered theoretically impossible. In 6 months, he had become fluent in 17 alien languages, earned combat decorations from 12 different Alliance species, and somehow convinced a Hive cluster mind to name him an honorary member. The Hive has never recognized individual consciousness outside our species, Commander Vale explained to the increasingly worried Alliance leadership. The concept of honorary membership did not exist until Lieutenant Ben made it necessary. Dr. Kit's psychological evaluation of Ben had been classified at the highest security levels. Subject demonstrates empathy responses that exceed documented limits for individual consciousness, she wrote. When exposed to distress signals from Alliance species, subject shows physiological stress responses indistinguishable from those observed when his own species is threatened. This suggests emotional bonding mechanisms that operate independently of genetic relationship. The implications were staggering. Humans did not just form alliances with other species, they adopted them as extended family members, complete with all the protective instincts that evolution had designed for genetic relatives. But the true scope of the human phenomenon became apparent when Intelligence Chief Oak delivered the classified report that would reshape the Alliance's understanding of their situation. Hegemony communications intercepts reveal strategic shifts that indicate fundamental changes in enemy doctrine, Oak reported to the Emergency Council session. They are not just retreating from human forces, they are retreating from sectors where human involvement is considered possible. The intelligence data painted a picture of an enemy empire in psychological collapse. Hegemony forces were abandoning strategic positions not because they had been defeated, but because their command structure could no longer predict human behavior with sufficient accuracy to develop effective countermeasures. Enemy communications reference something they call the human factor, Oak continued. Their strategists have identified human involvement as a variable that renders standard tactical planning obsolete. The hegemony had built their expansion strategy around predictable responses from species that followed logical patterns of behavior. They could calculate when Alliance forces would retreat, when they would negotiate, when they would accept acceptable losses in exchange for strategic gains. Humans followed no such patterns. They retreated when advance seemed logical, attacked when retreat seemed inevitable, and accepted casualty rates that should have been unacceptable while somehow avoiding casualties that should have been inevitable. The enemy has requested diplomatic contact, Oak revealed, producing shocked silence throughout the chamber. Not to negotiate surrender terms, but to negotiate human withdrawal from the conflict. Admiral Rook's crystal form pulsed with astonished light patterns. They want to negotiate with humans separately from the Alliance? Confirmed. Hegemony leadership appears to believe that human forces are mercenaries hired by the Alliance, and that appropriate payment might convince them to terminate their contract. The misunderstanding revealed how completely the hegemony had failed. to comprehend human psychology. They could not conceive of a species that would fight without payment, die for strangers, or adopt other people's causes as their own personal missions. But the most disturbing intelligence came from deep space, reconnaissance. Earth, far from being exhausted by providing 47 million volunteers to the Alliance cause, was using Alliance technology to expand at an unprecedented rate. Satellite observations of the Sol system indicate massive construction projects, Oak reported. Humans have established permanent colonies on 12 worlds and are conducting terraforming operations on 17 more. Population estimates suggest human numbers have reached 847 billion individuals. The Alliance had assumed that human support represented a significant sacrifice for a primitive species with limited resources. Instead, humans were using their involvement in galactic affairs as an opportunity for exponential expansion. Dr. Nova's final assessment captured the Alliance's growing realization that they had created something beyond their control or comprehension. Humans do not view the current conflict as our war that they are helping us fight, she wrote. They view it as their war that happens to involve us. The distinction is critical. We invited them to join our struggle for survival. They accepted our struggle as part of their expansion into galactic civilization. The Emergency Council session concluded with a question that none of the Alliance leadership could answer. What would happen when humans finished solving the problems they had been invited to address? The answer came 3 days later when Ambassador Ray submitted a formal proposal for something called the Galactic Commonwealth, a voluntary association of species that would replace both the Deathworld Alliance and the Hegemony Empire with what humans described as a more efficient system. The proposal included detailed plans for interspecies cooperation, resource sharing, conflict resolution, and expansion into unexplored regions of space. It was comprehensive, brilliantly designed, and absolutely inevitable. The Alliance had invited humans to help them survive. Instead, humans were helping them evolve into something that had never existed in galactic history, a civilization that worked. The inauguration ceremony took place on what had once been the Hegemony's capital world, now renamed Hope Station in the human tradition of giving optimistic names to conquered territories. President Joy stood before the assembled representatives of 847 species, delivering the inaugural address of the Galactic Commonwealth to the largest gathering of sentient beings in recorded history. The transformation had taken exactly one standard galactic year. 12 months ago, the Deathworld Alliance had been a desperate coalition of survivors, clinging to existence in the shadow of inevitable conquest. Today, they were witnessing the birth of the first voluntary interspecies government in galactic history. My fellow citizens, President Joy began, her words translated into 12,000 languages simultaneously. 1 year ago, you invited humanity to help you survive. We are honored that you have chosen to help us all thrive together. The statistics were staggering, but they only hinted at the scope of the transformation. Military casualties in the last 3 months? 0. Not because fighting had stopped, but because the remaining hegemony forces surrendered rather than face Commonwealth units. Economic productivity across former Alliance territory had increased by 2,300%. Scientific advancement was occurring at rates that required entirely new measurement systems. Most remarkably, suicide rates among non-human species had dropped to near 0. Dr. Nova's final xenobiological report identified the cause with scientific precision. Humans possessed an apparently unlimited capacity to make other sentient beings feel valued, understood, and genuinely loved. Admiral Rook, now serving as Commonwealth Defense Coordinator, watched the ceremony from his position among the founding delegates. His crystal form pulsed with patterns that would have been unimaginable a year ago, contentment mixed with bewildered awe. The hegemony's final stronghold had fallen not to military assault, but to mass defection. Emperor Caney himself had requested, asylum in Commonwealth space, not from his enemies but from his own former subjects who demanded trials for crimes against sentience. The surrender had been broadcast across the galaxy, watched by trillions of beings who witnessed the end of the last great galactic empire. But the Commonwealth was not built on conquest. It was built on something humans called voluntary association, a concept so foreign to galactic politics that most species lacked words for it in their native languages. Worlds joined the Commonwealth because they wanted to, not because they had been forced or bribed or threatened. Dr. Kit submitted her final psychological assessment from her new position as Commonwealth Social Integration Director. Her research had documented something unprecedented in galactic history: the complete elimination of xenophobia among member species. Humans had somehow infected the galaxy with their own peculiar inability to see other sentient beings as fundamentally alien. Subject populations demonstrate unprecedented levels of interspecies cooperation, she wrote. Previous barriers to social integration, biological incompatibility, cultural differences, evolutionary competition patterns, have been rendered irrelevant through human social modeling. Member species are adopting human integration behaviors as standard social protocols. The changes went far beyond politics or economics. The Commonwealth had created the galaxy's first truly universal culture, one that preserved the unique characteristics of each species while establishing common values that transcended biological differences. Children of different species played together in integrated schools. Scientists collaborated across evolutionary barriers that had once seemed insurmountable. Artists created works that expressed ideas no single species could have conceived alone. Scout Leader Finn, now Director of Exploration Services, submitted his reports on Commonwealth expansion with the same sense of unreality that had characterized every human-related development over the past year. Human population has reached 1.2 trillion individuals distributed across 400 worlds, he reported. Terraforming operations are proceeding on 150 additional worlds. Deep space exploration missions have established contact with 67 previously unknown species, all of whom have requested Commonwealth membership after initial diplomatic contact. The numbers defied biological possibility. No species in galactic history had expanded so rapidly while maintaining social cohesion and technological advancement. Humans were somehow achieving exponential growth without the resource conflicts, territorial disputes, or cultural fragmentation that had limited every other civilization. But the most remarkable development was occurring in the deep space missions that human exploration teams had launched toward the galactic rim. Contact with the Andromeda Galaxy had been established, and preliminary reports suggested that humanity's reputation had preceded them across intergalactic distances. Ambassador Ray, now serving as Intergalactic Relations Coordinator, delivered his report with the same cheerful enthusiasm that had characterized human diplomacy from the beginning. Andromeda representatives have requested assistance with their own galactic conflicts, he announced. Apparently, news of our success here has spread through quantum communication networks we did not know existed. The implications were staggering. Humans had not just transformed one galaxy, they had attracted the attention of other galaxies that were experiencing similar problems with aggressive expansionist empires. Commander Vale's cluster mind processed the data with 10,000 individual perspectives and reached a conclusion that challenged every assumption about the nature of civilization itself. Human expansion patterns suggest they view the current galaxy as a starting point rather than a destination, Vale reported. Projection models indicate human presence will extend beyond local galactic cluster within 10 standard cycles. Dr. Nova's final xenobiological assessment captured the profound transformation that had occurred. Humans have not simply joined galactic civilization, she wrote. They have redefined what galactic civilization means. Previous models assumed that interspecies cooperation required careful management of competing interests and limited resources. Humans have demonstrated that cooperation itself generates unlimited resources and eliminates competing interests. The evidence was overwhelming. Commonwealth worlds were more prosperous than they had ever been under independent governance. Scientific research was advancing faster than any single species could have achieved alone. Cultural development was producing art, literature, music, and philosophy that enriched every member species. Most importantly, warfare was becoming obsolete. Not because conflict had been eliminated, but because humans had demonstrated that cooperation produced better results than conquest. Aggressive species found themselves isolated and economically disadvantaged compared to Commonwealth members, who shared resources and knowledge freely. The final report came from Intelligence Chief Oak, who had spent the year documenting the psychological collapse of opposition movements throughout the galaxy. Remaining hostile factions have adopted Commonwealth governance models, he reported. Analysis indicates this is not the result of coercion or conquest, but voluntary recognition that human social systems produce superior outcomes for all participants. President Joy concluded her inaugural address with words that would be carved into monuments across 1,000 worlds. We stand today not as conquerors or conquered, but as family. Different in biology, united in purpose, diverse in culture, singular in our commitment to each other's welfare. This is the Commonwealth, not a government but a promise that no sentient being will ever again face extinction alone. The ceremony concluded with the Commonwealth Anthem, a musical composition that incorporated traditional elements from every member species. The harmony was impossible, beautiful, and uniquely human in its assumption that differences could create beauty rather than conflict. Admiral Rook found himself reflecting on the question that had haunted Alliance leadership for months. What would happen when humans finished solving the problems they had been invited to address? The answer was becoming clear. Humans did not solve problems and move on. They solved problems and found bigger problems to solve. They had transformed a desperate military alliance into a galactic civilization, and now they were looking toward other galaxies with the same enthusiastic determination that had once terrified the hegemony. The Alliance's fatal gamble had not been inviting humans to join their war. It had been assuming that humans would be content with just one galaxy to fix. As the inaugural ceremony concluded and representatives returned to their worlds, Admiral Rook realized that the Deathworld Alliance's greatest mistake had also been their greatest gift to the universe. They had introduced a species that could not conceive of problems too large to solve, distances too great to cross, or differences too profound to bridge. The galaxy would never be the same. And judging by the reports from Andromeda, neither would the universe. Somewhere in the vast Commonwealth archives, the original message that had started everything was preserved. We are the Deathworld Alliance. We face extinction. We invite you to stand with us. Humanity's response had been simple. We accept. The consequences of that acceptance would ripple across the cosmos for millennia to come.